Did you know that in 1893, Tesla created a machine that could create earthquakes? How about brain surgery done thousands of years ago? Or what about swords made from advanced metal? Well, it may sound unbelievable, but that's exactly the kind of thing you're going to see today. Number 7. Nikola Tesla's earthquake machine. Everyone knows about Hufeng Didongyi, the world's first seismometer, invented by Zhang Heng in 132 AD during China's Han Dynasty. It could detect distant earthquakes long before people felt them. But centuries later, someone tried to go a step further. Not just detect them, but accidentally create one. That someone was Nikola Tesla. By the 1890s, Tesla was already deep into experiments with electricity and energy transmission. Around 1896, he started working on a steam-powered mechanical oscillator, a small device designed to produce controlled vibrations. The idea was simple on paper: generate oscillations, match frequencies, and transfer energy. By 1897, the machine was ready. And then came the part that people still argue about. Tesla later claimed that while testing the device in his New York lab at 48 East Houston Street, he began adjusting it to match the natural frequency of the building. As he increased the power, things started to shift. Vibrations spread through the structure. Metal creaked. Equipment moved. According to Tesla, it reached a point where the entire building began shaking hard enough to alarm people nearby. Police and ambulances were reportedly called, thinking it was an earthquake. Tesla himself described the moment pretty clearly. The vibrations kept intensifying until the machinery started moving around the room. Realizing it was getting out of control, he grabbed a hammer and smashed the device before it could go further. Later, he told his assistants to stay quiet and let authorities assume it was just a natural tremor. In 1912, journalist Alan L. Benson wrote about Tesla demonstrating a similar concept, claiming he could make a steel structure sway just by matching its resonance. Now, here's the reality. The machine was never powerful enough to trigger real earthquakes, but it did create one. Number 6. The Inca's quipu system. The Inca civilization, which thrived in the Andes before the arrival of the Europeans, was not just a powerful empire. It was running a system most people still don't fully understand. Instead of writing things down, they used something called the quipu, which is basically a network of colored cords with carefully placed knots that carried detailed information. These weren't simply random strings. The Incas used them to track census data, taxes, military organization, and stored goods across their empire. Specially trained officials, known as quipucamayaks, were responsible for reading and maintaining them, and they could interpret patterns that looked meaningless to anyone else. For a long time, researchers believed quipus only handled numbers. Mathematicians Marcia and Robert Asher showed how the knots followed a decimal system, with each position representing a specific value. But that idea started to shift. In 2017, anthropologist Sabine Hayland studied surviving quipus and found evidence suggesting around 95 distinct symbols. I'm pointing toward a logosyllabic system, something closer to actual writing. Then, in 2026, scientist Richard Dosselman, working with Edward Doolittle and Vatika Tayal at the First Nations University of Canada, approached the quipu from a totally new angle. Instead of translating it, they rebuilt it. Using C++ and Python, they created a digital version of the quipu structure and introduced a new file format called .qpu. They didn't stop there. Their team built working spreadsheets, file systems, and encryption tools using that structure. Tests showed it could handle hierarchical data efficiently, with performance comparable to modern data systems in certain cases. So, The Inca never had written language in the traditional sense. Number 5. Ancient brain surgery. Well, brain surgery is not something new. It's old. We mean, so old that humans have been doing it for thousands of years. It's called trepanning, or trepanation, in which a hole is drilled or scraped directly into the human skull. And this isn't a theory. Archaeologists have found clear evidence going back 7,000 to 10,000 years, with skulls discovered in places like Peru, France, and Ukraine. One site in France, dated around 6,500 BCE, had 40 trepan skulls out of 120. That's not a rare accident. That's a practice. What's even harder to wrap your head around is that many of these people actually survived. You can see it in the bone itself. The edges healed, meaning they lived long enough for the skull to recover. In some regions, survival rates were surprisingly high. By the Iron Age, it's estimated to be around 78%. So why were they doing this? In some cases, it was clearly medical, and in other cases, it wasn't medical at all. Many cultures believed odd behavior or illness was caused by spirits, so opening the skull was seen as a way to release them. Of course, it sounds super brutal, and it is. But for them, it made sense. Number 4. Tesla death beam. Tesla was not only experimenting with his so-called earthquake machine, but he was also thinking on a much larger and honestly more dangerous scale. By the time he reached his late 70s, his ideas hadn't slowed down at all. In fact, they got even bolder. On his 78th birthday in 1934, Tesla told the New York Times that he had developed what he believed was his most important invention. He described a weapon powerful enough to stop entire armies instantly. Not over time, not with explosions, but on the spot. He called it teleforce. The press quickly labeled it a death beam, but Tesla didn't like that name. According to him, it wasn't about destruction, it was about defense. His idea was to accelerate tiny particles, possibly mercury-based, inside a vacuum chamber and fire them at extreme speeds, around 48 times the speed of sound. The result, at least in theory, would be a focused stream of energy capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. He claimed it could bring down up to 10,000 enemy aircraft from a distance of 250 miles. At another point, he said it could create a defensive barrier stretching nearly 200 miles, making any country effectively untouchable. He even described it as an invisible wall, comparing it to a kind of modern-day Chinese wall, but far more powerful. Tesla insisted this wasn't a traditional ray. He argued that actual rays lose strength over distance due to the inverse square law, which makes them ineffective at long range. His design instead relied on physical particles carrying concentrated energy directly to a target. He tried to sell the idea to several governments, including the US. None of them moved forward with it. The only country that showed any real interest was the Soviet Union, which conducted a limited test in 1939. Number 3. The Viking Ulfberht swords. Well, most people think of Vikings as brutal fighters swinging around rough, heavy weapons. But then you come across something like the Ulfberht swords, and that idea starts to fall apart pretty quickly. These blades showed up during the Viking Age, between the 8th and 11th centuries, and nearly 170 of them have been discovered across Europe. Each one carried a distinct inscription, plus VLFBERHT+. That marking alone set them apart, almost like a signature of quality, something other sword makers even tried to copy. But the real shock wasn't the name, it was the metal. When archaeologists studied these swords, they found steel with an unusually high carbon content, far cleaner and stronger than anything commonly produced in Europe at that time. To get metal like that, you need a process known as crucible steel, where iron is heated to extremely high temperatures to remove impurities. The problem is that the method wasn't supposed to exist in Europe until about 800 years later. So how did they get it? Well, one theory points east. In 2014, a 9th century Viking grave found in Scandinavia included a ring with an inscription translating to "For Allah." That discovery hinted at contact between Viking traders and the Islamic world, where advanced steelmaking techniques, similar to Damascus steel, were already known. Another angle came in 2020, when German researchers suggested some of these swords may have been produced in regions of Germany, possibly by a highly skilled workshop operating far ahead of its time. And then there's the strange part. Not all Ulfberht swords are equal. Some are clearly lower quality, almost like counterfeit versions, suggesting other smiths tried to imitate the name without understanding the process. But no one knows the actual truth. Was the actual. Number 2. The Indus Valley's urban plumbing. The Indus Valley was one of the most mysterious and sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. And the way they built their cities makes that clear right away. We're talking about Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa over 4,000 years ago, and nothing about them looks primitive. The streets were laid out in clean grid patterns. Every building followed the same direction. Even the bricks were standardized in a precise 4:2:1 ratio. That level of consistency doesn't happen unless someone is planning everything carefully. But the real surprise is the plumbing. Most houses had their own bathing areas, connected directly to a drainage system running beneath the streets. These weren't open ditches either. The sewers were covered, brick-lined, and designed to carry waste away from the city. And Mohenjo-Daro had one of the best systems. Clay pipes carried wastewater from homes into main drains, which then led out toward nearby rivers. The Great Bath, built with tightly sealed bricks using tar and gypsum mortar, could actually hold water without leaking. Every home had access to clean water through wells, and many were even multi-story with internal layouts that stayed consistent across the city. And the strange part is, it took other parts of the world over 1,000 years to build anything close to this. Number 1. The armored knight robot. This thing might look like something straight out of a video game, but the idea goes back much further than that. We're talking about the late 1400s, and the man behind it was Leonardo da Vinci. Well, Tess, the same Leonardo. Sometime around 1495, while working under Ludovico Sforza, under the Duke of Milan, Leonardo designed what is now known as a mechanical knight. Not a sketch for fun, not a fantasy concept, actual working plans. The design was hidden inside his notebooks, specifically the Codex Atlanticus and the Madrid Codices, and it stayed there for centuries. It wasn't until the 1950s that researchers at the University of California started digging through those notes and realized what they were looking at. A full-scale armored figure built to move, and it could move. According to the recovered designs, the knight was able to sit, stand, raise its visor, and move its arms. All of this was done using a system of pulleys, cables, and gears hidden inside a suit of armor without electricity or motors. Just mechanical engineering. For a long time, people thought there was a complex device in the torso powering it. But later studies showed that piece was actually part of a clock mechanism and had nothing to do with the knight itself. There's also a record suggesting it was demonstrated at a court event in Milan in 1495. Imagine being in that room. A full suit of armor suddenly moves on its own. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but enough to make people stop and stare. It wasn't just a showpiece either. The design reflects how deeply Leonardo understood anatomy and mechanics, combining both into a working system. And when you look at modern humanoid robots today, like the ones developed by Boston Dynamics for DARPA, the connection becomes hard to ignore. Well, that's us from us. What do you think about these old inventions? Let us know. And be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. Until then, take care, and we'll see you soon.